happening in person and online, and we look forward to dialogue with all of you in the audience over the course of our time together in the next hour. Let me first introduce the MEP who I'm honored to have with me here in the room in Brussels. Dragos Tudorake is a member of the European Parliament from Romania. He is a member of the Renew Europe group, and most importantly, for purposes of our discussion today, he is in charge of the most important special committee on AI in the European Parliament, and was recently named co-rapporteur of the AI Act in the Civil Liberties Committee. So MEP Tudorake, welcome. Pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Let me also introduce online Angelika Dedopoulou, who is Senior Policy Manager for AI and FinTech at Meta, formerly known as Facebook. Angelika is with us from Greece today, and we are really honored to have her here. Angelika, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're delighted to have you. We want to talk about a number of issues that are of importance to this group and all of our audience related to AI. And in particular, we're interested in talking about and thinking through some of the questions that are being asked of legislative bodies on both sides of the Atlantic and regulators, and that is what is necessary for policymakers to address to ensure the innovative deployment of AI. We hear a lot about a risk-based approach to AI that we'll be talking about today, a focus on AI's applications, which are broad and beneficial. So a question for policymakers is, how is it possible to facilitate the deployment of innovative AI services while also making sure that businesses and consumers that are users of AI and beneficiaries of AI are protected? A risk-based approach to AI that we'll talk about today takes account of the fact that there are applications of AI that implicate fundamental rights and should be subject to closer scrutiny, whereas at the same time there are applications of AI that do not implicate fundamental rights, that are not so-called high-risk areas of AI that perhaps shouldn't be subject to as close legislative scrutiny. So the question is, how do we get the definitions right? How do we get the definition of AI itself right? And how do we get the definitions of where AI should be subject to stricter scrutiny because of its implication of fundamental rights? These are questions that came up very recently in the Trade and Technology Council discussion that took place in Paris-Saclay earlier this week, outside of Paris, the second gathering of the EU and the US leadership. The Trade and Technology Council has 10 working groups, and one of those working groups is focused on AI. It will be a subject of discussion in the coming months in advance of the next Trade and Technology Council meeting, which is scheduled to take place in the US this fall. This past weekend, the Trade and Technology Council discussion of AI was focused on how to unify EU and US regulatory approaches to AI. So we certainly wanted to consider that in our discussions today as well. So to start us off, I wanted to ask MEP Tudorake to talk to us a little bit about how AI became a focus of your legislative work here in Brussels, what your work is focused on now, and what you think is necessary for the Parliament to be looking at as far as the AI Act and what it should focus on, in your view.
Well, thank you very much, and many thanks also for inviting me to this debate, to this webinar. So if I'm to start a bit with a historic foray, as you invited me to, I think we have to understand that where we are today is the result of a buildup that started several years ago with the Commission. In fact, it started several years ago already with the OECD principles, and then discussions on key principles that would guide work on AI happening in different fora. Multilateral, bilateral. And then at some point, the European Commission, understanding that this was something that was important and needed to be prepared for, let's say, a broader vision of how the digital realm would need to be regulated. We had the high-level expert group already in the past, in the last mandate, which basically looked into the principles, and then with the start of this mandate, there was a very clear commitment on the part of this commission that they would actually come with this puzzle, basically, of legislation that would more or less try to to put the signposts for how the rules of the digital world need to look like. And by now, we are in the second half of this mandate, of this political mandate, of this commission, of this parliament. And by now, we see that various pieces of this puzzle are starting to come to fruition. So we've had the DSA, DMA, so soon, hopefully, we're going to also have a conclusion on AI Act and all those other pieces of legislation that all together, again, will form the manual in a way for the future. Now, so this is the historical perspective. What the parliament has done from the start of this mandate is, number one, to put this on its map. Because if you look at the work and the focus of parliament in the previous mandate and also in the first days of this parliament, this was something that, okay, we recognize it was important. The commission was speaking about it, but it wasn't something that we as MEPs felt we needed to do something a bit more concrete other than await legislation to come. And I think our capacity as an institution to have foresight in this, the fact that the parliament decided to have the special committee that you mentioned on artificial intelligence, I think it helped us not only in the way it educated us as regulators to prepare us for the moment of today, when we are actually putting our hands on legislation, but also to understand the complexities, the implications of this otherwise very complex technology and the impacts that it can have in everything from how our society works, from how our economy works, and also how our democracies and how our politics work. So I think that institutionally, we've never been as equipped as we are today, in fact, to legislate. And I'm actually quite proud to say this, because a lot of the work that I've done chairing AIDA, chairing the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in Parliament, has really been focused on doing that, helping fellow MEPs, helping all of us, helping the Parliament to get itself at the stage where it can comprehend what it regulates, given again the complexity and the very deep, profound and long-standing implications that this legislation will have. The second leg of this mandate, as I understood it, was to perform what I always call the AI diplomacy. But in fact, it's a broader digital diplomacy in a way, understanding that the rules that we'll write, the standards that will come after these rules, this is something that we cannot just write here and hope for the Brussels effect to kick in, which is something that, okay, comfortably you can say, well, it happened with GDPR, we're just going to write some rules again, and therefore afterwards, just because of the Brussels effect, everyone else around the world will be taking them up. I don't think it's going to work that way, not with AI, and not with some of the other pieces of legislation, particularly those that are governing data and the use of data. So therefore, I think there needs to be quite a substantial effort on our side as politicians to actually reach out to other like-minded partners, be they bilateral or multilateral, and actually ensure that what we do here is aligned also with the thinking, the vision, the understanding on the other side, on the basis that the values that guides our work are shared. And you mentioned TTC, a very important framework in which we do exactly this with the transatlantic partner. I was very happy to see from the very beginning that AI was very much firmly anchored in this conversation. It was there in Pittsburgh, it was in Paris, it's going to be also again. And I open a bracket. What is also interesting, and I think important, is the way it started from defining an agenda, which I think Pittsburgh was all about, to getting very more concretely on this designing and discussing policies. And I think Paris was about that. And my understanding also from talking to the two executive vice presidents that were present there yesterday, we had them in the discussion in Parliament. The next meeting is going to be about discussing projects. And I think this sort of cascade from agenda setting to getting down to discussing and setting common projects, I think is a very good approach in dealing along the transatlantic relationship with these discussions on technology, of course, important on trade issues and alignment there as well. But if I am to speak of AI, I'm actually happy that TTC happened. I'm happy that the work is actually quite intense. There needs, of course, to be also parliamentary scrutiny on that. And interestingly enough, this weekend, we're going to have a transatlantic legislators dialogue taking also place again in Paris, which will very nicely, in fact, follow up to the discussions at executive level in Paris this week in the TTC, because we need to get also legislators aligned, even if an understanding that we have different cultures, different legal traditions, and we're going to regulate these things differently. And I think we have to live with that fact. I don't think it's a good objective to try to force each other into following the same legislative path, let's say. Yes, I think we have to live with the fact that we're not going to see legislation in Congress anytime soon regulating AI the way we do. But we might see an AI Bill of Rights that is going to come out of the White House, for example, something that the White House announced. And if the principles are aligned, again, and they are aligned, I would say almost by default, because the values behind them are the same. But again, if the way we define the principles is something similar, and then on the side, we also work together on standards and how we define standards and how we measure AI. What is trustworthy AI? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the American side? I think, again, we are on a good path. And then similarly, we have to do that also reaching out to the others, because it's also about Japan, it's also about South Korea, India. India, for example, who, as you know, is also seeking a TTC with Europe, that is also certainly going to discuss AI, and India is very advanced in preparing its self-legislation on AI. So we need to be aware of this broader context in which the work in Parliament is being done. And now that we start the legislative work in Parliament, I think if we get these bearings right, I think also the work on the legislative act is going to be a properly guided one.
Very interesting. And it sounds like in that transatlantic legislative dialogue, you might have an opportunity to let your colleagues, your counterparts in the US know about some of the work that you're doing here, because as you said, you're farther ahead in the discussions than the US is on the legislative front. Well, we've heard some opening remarks on the parliamentary efforts here around AI policy. Let's turn to Angelica to ask about the industry perspective. Meta is obviously deeply involved in AI, both as a user of AI within the company to help your customers, but also in deploying AI as a product itself for customers to make use of as you bring people into the metaverse. Can you give us a little bit of the Meta perspective on the policy landscape for AI regulation? What's your approach to the European initiatives? And if you have any thoughts to share on the US landscape as well, that would be very interesting. Meta is one of the companies that is most deeply involved in the AI policy discussions. So it's great to have you here to share your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much once again for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here today to offer Meta's perspective on the AI Act and share also this panel discussion with Mr. Tudorakis, who is leading this important effort. So we'll start by saying that we welcome the Commission's efforts to lay down harmonized rules for AI systems, in line also with the guidelines presented by the Commission's President von der Leyen to support the European Union in being a global leader in the development of a secure, trustworthy, and ethical artificial intelligence. As we know, Europe is currently the pioneer on these regulatory requirements. So we believe that the AI Act has the potential to strengthen Europe's position as a global hub of excellence in AI, from the lab to the market, ensuring also at the same time that we're able to unlock the potential of AI for industrial use, which is something very important. So we're hopeful that the AI Act can promote trustworthy AI, as also Mr. Tudorakis mentioned, while laying a foundation for AI innovation throughout Europe. I would say that the fundamental challenge, however, is to develop a regulation that is flexible enough to adapt to future technologies, while not overly restrictive to the point of suppressing valuable and beneficial innovations but also and uses in a way of AI technology. So the benefits to society will only be maximized if regulators are careful not to restrict the massive innovative power being unlocked by AI, but rather actually supporting and guiding the whole process, ensuring always that small and medium enterprises, which are actually the cornerstone of the European economy, are in the loop and have all the benefits to, let's say, to thrive on AI. So this is my reply.
Thank you. MEP Tudorache, I wanted to come back to you on the question of definitions, because you correctly, I think, highlighted how the biggest challenge in all of this is coming up with the right definitions, and they're very fundamental. At the beginning, even the definition of what AI is, and then you also made reference to the definition of what high risk is, what fundamental rights are. We have a pretty good understanding, but within the AI world, there are a lot of different fundamental rights that may be implicated. So I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about the importance of those definitions. How much of that work needs to be done in the legislative process, and how much of it do you feel comfortable leaving to the regulatory process, the implementation that would be done by the Commission after you do your legislative work, or even to industry for industry standards to be set? Can you talk to us about the definitional question as you're thinking through the legislative package?
Thank you. A very important question, and also one that I believe will actually be drawing quite a lot of attention during the negotiation, and where I think also we're going to see playing out quite a lot of the ideological battles between the political groups in Parliament, and then afterwards in the interaction with the other co-legislator, the Council. This issue of definition, number one, has, at least up to now, has spinned a lot around the scope and how broad or how narrow the initial definition of the text is. So what is AI? And there have been many discussions and attempts, even now, arguments that, for example, we should try and be precise in that first definition. And that first definition should deliberately exclude some type of applications or some typology of algorithms or certain sectors, simply because, I don't know, either because their purpose is not clear enough, or because several sectors are regulated in other through other pieces of legislation, and therefore they should not be part of the scope of this text. My personal view is that that initial definition should be an all-encompassing one. And the reason why I believe that is that the whole logic of this text, speaking of the high risk and the trustworthiness and the whole the approach that the Commission has taken with that pyramid of risks, in fact, where, from my point of view, precision and clarity is needed, is in how you define those use cases that are either in the first category, in the tip of the pyramid, the prohibited applications use cases, in the middle section, which is the high risk, in the, let's say, lower middle section, which is the ones that are requiring extra transparency, and then the very broad base of the pyramid remains unregulated, in fact. So even if they would be coming under the big umbrella created by the first big definition of what AI is, it doesn't mean that they would actually be burdened by regulation. Because again, unless you are venturing into the prohibited part or in the high risk part, then you escape regulation. And I think an important nuance also in terms of the high risk, or those requiring transparency. High risk applications are not, that is not bad AI. You can actually very well do, and it's necessary AI. It's just that because of its implications, because of the way it may impact the rights of those that are being subject or that are using that application, you need, as a developer or as a user, as a deployer, and that distinction in terms of responsibility is also a very important one, which will need to be very carefully balanced and defined in this text. And another big ideological debate is going to be on that one. So again, you will just have to go through certain compliance requirements. It doesn't mean before you go on the market, it doesn't mean that you cannot develop or use that kind of AI. So that's the philosophy, the way I see it right now in terms of how we play with definitions. I do take it as a responsibility that I see I have to provide as much clarity as possible for how we define the prohibited applications, for how we define the high-risk applications, because that precision will benefit those that are going to continue to innovate. And that is a fundamental objective for this text. And I keep it in the back of my mind, even if I am a rapporteur for LIBE and I'm due to, let's say, defend more the way this text is going to protect and safeguard the rights of those affected by AI. But I also feel that I have a duty of care in terms of how I fight and preserve for this objective of stimulating innovation, of allowing creativity, of boosting the energy that AI actually can bring into our economies. And I think we can do that, again, by being precise in these definitions, by being very clear on how we define what is high risk, because then, as you rightly said, there comes the second layer, which is writing standards. And writing technical standards, if a legal definition is vague, is going to be very difficult. And again, I think for those engineers that we want to continue to work on AI, that we want to continue to put stimulating applications out there to also encourage people to trust and uptake AI in their everyday lives. Again, I think in the work that we'll do, we'll have to be very careful on how we play with the definitions and how we allow for those definitions to be translated into proper standards.
That makes good sense. It's as if you're viewing AI as a tool and paying more attention to what it's used for, the behaviors that are enabled by the AI, so that, as you said, it doesn't prevent an innovator from deploying AI in an area that would implicate high risk. It just holds that deployment to the same kind of standards for evaluating the behavior, whether it's lending or hiring or firing or other areas that might implicate fundamental rights. You're just making sure that the use of that tool, AI, is done in the right way and that the behavior is targeted, not the tool itself. That makes a lot of sense.
We're not regulating the technology. That is something that has to be understood. This text is not regulating the technology, it's regulating the use of the technology.
That makes a lot of sense. Angelica, let me come to you for the question of definitions and your perspective from the industry on how that work can be done to define, starting with defining AI itself, but equally importantly, as MEP Tudorache talked about, how to define what a high risk area is that AI is used for, how to define how the use of that tool of AI should be evaluated by regulators. What's your view on where those definitions should be drawn from and how we can make sure it's done in the right way?
Sure. So actually, I will start with the most debated definition, which is the one of AI. So the AI Act is currently actually defining AI to include machine learning approaches of various kinds, but also include all logic and knowledge-based approaches, statistical approach, Bayesian estimation, and so on. So from the industry point of view and from our view, this definition of AI is quite vague to the point that it could potentially reach almost any modern software-based product. So rather than focusing on the techniques and approaches at the basis of the software at issue, we suggest adopting actually a definition that revolves around software that first is machine-based and secondly is able to learn over time. So this is why we suggest the Commission take in consideration, and also the Parliament now during the current negotiations, take in consideration the definition used by the OECD expert AI group, which distinguishes between complex AI systems and other logic-based algorithms. And this definition also would allow to target the novel risks that AI systems uniquely present, while at the same time avoiding overly broad scope that may impose regulatory burdens on technologies, as Mr. Tudorache mentioned, that do not present the same challenges that the Act intends to tackle. Now, another vague, let's say, definition of the current text is the one of provider, that does not necessarily reflect the reality of the AI ecosystem. So in fact, it does not take into account the complex processes involved in developing an AI system that are generally delivered through multiple actors. So placing most duties on a simplistic account of provider overlooks how these systems learn and evolve post-release. At the same time, ignores several important actors, like, for example, researchers, innovators, open source developers, so the broader, let's say, stakeholder ecosystem around AI, who contribute to the development of AI systems in different ways. So according to us, the act should introduce a more granular taxonomy that is more representative of the multifaceted, actually multi-actor development during the whole process of AI, so from the launch to deployment and maintenance process. And examples, of course, of these definitions have already been embraced by other international organizations like UNCITRAL. So perhaps it will be good to take in consideration this, let's say, international definition provided and well accepted by the broader community and reflected actually into the current AI Act.
And let's ask about how this is going, how this discussion is going in the Parliament, because there have been a number of reports. You've released a report with your colleague from Italy very recently. There have been other reports issued by other colleagues of yours. Actually, the first question we got from the audience was about the status of the next legislative draft, which I'm sure everyone is eager to hear about. But let's back up before we get to the next draft and ask for your perception of how the discussion is going among your colleagues. Obviously, you've been very active in trying to build a coalition of support for action across the Parliament. These discussions that we've had here have been focused on the importance of getting the definitions right and making sure that it's a risk-based approach and that the technology, as you said, isn't targeted, but the behavior is. Can you share with us how the discussion is going with your colleagues around these issues, the concerns you're hearing, and some of the progress you think has been made in helping, not everyone's as much of an expert as you are on these issues, helping your 700 plus colleagues understand how important it is to do this right?
We are in quite a complex machinery, in fact, with this piece of legislation, probably more complex than others, which I think is a testimony in itself as to how important it is and also how much importance the political groups attach to this draft. There's been already last year quite a battle of competence between the committees on actually who's going to take the lead on this. And we ended up with quite a massive construction with two committees in the lead, IMCO, the internal market, and LIBE, the civil liberties. That's why we have two rapporteurs, but also with a whole constellation of other committees providing inputs, some with exclusive competence in certain provisions and others just opinions, which of course will have to be taken into account in the final version of the report. So we are now, in terms of where we are now at a stage where all of these inputs are coming in. So some committees have already put forward their reports, were more advanced in the preparatory work they did. Others are a bit slower. They are going to come. The deadline is somewhere in July for all of the committees to come in, and the contributing committees to come in and provide their opinions or their draft reports. As far as the two main rapporteurs, myself and Brando Benifei, are concerned, we've put forward our first version of the report already 3 weeks back. And there already what you see is a low common denominator between the two of us. Those are the points where we could, let's say, easily agree. So you already see certain changes, certain directions that we have ourselves given in this debate. We had last week a first debate around this first draft, a debate where, again, it was a good moment to see how the different political families in Parliament are positioning themselves, what they see as things where they could align, and what things they would like to add or contest. So by now, I think we have already a first map of the various, let's say, political views and interests and how they will play out. The second, and I'll come back and mention a few highlights in what is already in our report and some of the reactions on those ones. In terms of next steps, in fact, today was supposed to be the last day of amendments to our report. At the request of actually quite a number of fellow MEPs, we've pushed the deadline. Again, it shows, in fact, how much intense work is being done behind the scenes to prepare for these amendments. I do expect that we're going to have thousands of amendments coming in, and we've extended the deadline to the 1st of June. So by the 1st of June, MEPs will come in with amendments. We as rapporteurs can do our own amendments to our own report. It might sound weird, but actually those things that we could not agree upon between the two of us, we're going to bring in a separate amendments. I'm going to myself put forward some amendments by the 1st of June. And then throughout summer, we're going to work once the opinions of the other committees will come in. We will work, myself and Brando, we will work to try to harmonize all of this constellation of views and amendments into what is called compromise amendments. That will then be negotiated with the political families, and sometimes in autumn. We will have votes in the committees, and then hopefully a vote in plenary for what will be then the final commission, parliament position on it, and basically the mandate for the negotiations that we're going to have to go into the discussions with the council. In terms of the main points, as you have already anticipated, and as I mentioned, definitions is one point where I expect that there will still be amendments coming. Also, what Angelica was saying, we also heard from several actors in Parliament as well, some actually arguing for taking some of the elements from the OECD definition and actually importing them into our text. So we will see, certainly, again, there will be work on definitions. And what we see right now is certainly not the final product. There was quite a reaction also on the prohibited practices, where already in the draft report, myself and Brando agreed to add predictive policing as another area where it would be prohibited to produce and to market algorithms. And I've heard from political groups more to the left of the House asking for additional bans. So again, there will be quite an ideological battle that will go on in terms of adding to the list of Article 5 of prohibited practices some other areas. On top of the ban on biometric recognition, remote biometric recognition in public spaces, which is also an area where there's quite a strong wind blowing in terms of in Parliament blowing in favor of imposing a ban. Then, of course, the high risk definitions and the list of use cases in Annex 3 is also going to be a place where there'll be a lot of discussions. We've added ourselves several elements extra, points that we considered were important and where we agreed, but I can anticipate, and also hearing some of the shadow rapporteurs in the conversations of last week, there will be more additions to the list of high risk. Then there's governance. We've actually made quite a reshuffle already in the draft report in terms of governance. And we did that because we both share the view that what the Commission had proposed was not enough. The construction of the Commission with basically all of the implementation being done at national level was something that we both believed would actually be fragmenting the digital single market that we want to build, and will actually lead to very haphazard and almost dysfunctional sometimes ways of implementing this text. And therefore, we've elevated quite a number of tasks and competencies at the central level, at European level, enforcing also the tasks of the AI board, which will be the governing body at EU level. And in fact, according to my own taste, I would like to add even further responsibilities on the AI board, because I do believe that this is how we would ensure consistency of application and enforcement of this text across the land. And the second objective, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of governance, is to ensure a systematic interaction between stakeholders and regulators. And I think this is something that, at least for the industry, but also for the stakeholders such as civil society and academia, is something that is very important. Talking to the industry only as an afterthought, I always say that, is wrong when you are regulating something like AI. You need to have the stakeholders at the table. You need to listen to their experiences in actually playing with the law, implementing the law, applying its rules, to be able to adapt, because the law also has to be future-proof, has to be adaptable, and through the use of this technique with annexes, it is actually possible to do that. But we can do that in a way that anchors you in the reality on the ground, in the reality of the innovators of the industry, only if you can actually talk to them regularly. And again, not only by organizing a conference every now and then, but actually by having them systematically at the table and co-generating basically the kind of adaptations that will be necessary. It's not something that has been done a lot here in Europe, having this sort of systematic interaction with stakeholders, but I think this is something that now, for this particular type of governance, we need to have in. Then there's the responsibility, and I think we also heard what is a provider, and where does the responsibility of a provider ends, and where does the responsibility of those that actually take a piece of algorithm, feed it with its own data, and when deploying, adapts that piece of algorithm into something else. Where is the responsibility between, where do you move the cursor between one and the other? There may be nuances and stages in between that you need to also regulate and properly define, so that at the end, you have a very clear chain of responsibility from the ones that are actually writing the first lines of code, all the way to those that are going to deploy and take that piece of algorithm and its concrete applications to the final consumer. And I think, again, that is something that in the process of preparing legislation right now, we'll have to get right.
So, Angelica, let's take Dragos Tudorake up on his invitation and talk a little bit about what compliance looks like with these very complex regulatory ideas that may be moving forward into legislation. So compliance for a company like Meta with these kind of rules would require compliance activities around data use and data transfer, around transparency. We heard about human oversight of the algorithm itself. What does that kind of compliance look like? What does Meta have to think about as a one of the most prominent users of AI in the technology industry? And what should legislators be thinking about for what that compliance looks like in industry?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Very interesting question. So I will start first of all by saying that we support the idea of requiring a risk management system for high-risk AI systems. However, predictability, certainty, and clarity are important components of this requirement. AI is not an area that benefits from extensive existing best practices where those terms have an understood significance. Rather, it is actually an area where standards and best practices are still emerging. So placing unclear terms into regulation, as Mr. Tudorake mentioned, without ensuring at the same time that they have widely accepted meanings, will create instead a profound legal uncertainty for AI developers, and at the same time, this actually will hinder innovation. So it's incredibly important to have advancing AI systems that work fairly and equitably for everyone, starting at the level of data governance, as you mentioned. So the Commission proposal attempts to ensure that high-risk AI performs well and is unbiased by mandating the data, for example, be relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete, which in this case is neither feasible nor practical, let's say, standard. So there are a few things to keep in mind through the regulatory phase. So first, bias does not come exclusively from data. The Commission and the European Parliament should look to promote fairness across the AI system lifecycle instead of focusing entirely on data. So these types of standards should keep in mind also the balance with important principles such as the principle of data minimization. And it is crucial also that the regulator keeps in mind existing rules so that they don't conflict with the new ones. And it's also important that requirements around data sets do not prohibit the use of privacy enhancing technologies, but rather actually encourage it. At the same time, I would like to point out that as currently drafted AI Act assumes that AI systems have an elevated risk if they're themselves or are intended to be used as safety components of products required actually under the third-party conformity assessment. However, this assumption is faulty because the requirement to undergo third-party conformity assessment is not necessarily depending on the risk level of a product. I mean, they can also be required in certain cases simply because there are no applicable harmonized standards. As we know, we don't have existing, standards at the moment, or where harmonized standards are available if they can only be applied to the product in part. So this could lead to many IS systems being classified as high risk, mainly because the product is not covered by harmonized standards, regardless, as Mr. Tudoraki mentioned, of the actual risk they pose. So I would say that this situation arises especially for new and innovative products where, for example, standards have often not been developed yet. So we believe that the current approach introduces stricter requirements for AI systems, as I said, especially on new and innovative products, regardless of the risks they effectively pose. And this does not really match with the AI Act's aim of fostering innovation and targeting only high-risk scenarios. And at the same time, it is not also aligned with the proportional approach underpinning the Act. So to conclude, we believe that the connection between the risk being addressed and the AI is a necessary criterion to trigger the classification of a high-risk AI system. And this way, actually, there is also an incentive to still include AI components in a product that could help make the product safer. So now to the point that Mr. Tudoraki mentioned about how, for example, how can the AI Act support the AI ecosystem in Europe and how we can actually promote collaboration between companies and regulators. We believe that the AI Act can help stakeholders in the AI ecosystem work together to build and test approaches to ensure that machine learning systems are designed and used in a responsible way. So at Meta, specifically, we strongly believe that the AI regulation best practices and standards should be the product of a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is why we're currently also launching the EU AI Act Open Loop program, which is a part of a broader experimental governance initiative supported by Meta, but also other type of stakeholders. And the program actually builds on the collaboration and contributions of a consortium composed of governments, regulators, tech businesses, but also academia. And what we want to do is actually test new and different approaches to laws and regulations before they're enacted. So stakeholders can better understand how well they'll work in the real world. So we will start this program in June, so in like 1 week from now, 2 weeks approximately from now. And our main goal is to inform the AI governance debate and also contribute to the to improve specific sections of the European AI Act by testing in real time key concepts, provisions and processes which are related to technical and procedural requirements of the European AI Act. So I would like to illustrate, and the reason why I mentioned this example is that what we want to achieve is to invite the Commission and the Parliament to consider mechanisms and forums that will allow for the development of necessary standards and best practices in collaboration always with the industry. European policy makers at the end must work together with experts from let's say different companies, from the private sector, SMEs, as I mentioned before, to ensure a balanced approach.
That fits very well with your suggestion of working collaboratively with industry so policymakers can benefit from voluntary industry standards and those all-important definitions of high risk. And Angelica's focus on high risk and a risk-based approach, which also echoes your approach, leads me to the next question we have from the audience here, which is about a communication from the French presidency earlier this week, suggesting a much broader approach to AI regulation than the one that's currently under consideration in the Parliament, specifically suggesting that all forms of AI should be targeted for regulation potentially. So the question from our audience member about this is, given that the French presidency has suggested regulating general purpose AI providers as opposed to going away, moving toward a risk-based approach that we've been talking about today, such that all general purpose AI would have to comply with the majority of requirements. Given our questioner asks, given that your proposal is more risk-based, and as we've been talking about, that seems to be a logical place to move. If you had any reactions to the French presidency's remarks earlier this week and the suggestion, the new compromise text suggestion, that it proposes more general purpose AI regulation?
Well, depends on how you want to read the proposal coming from the French presidency. I think that proposal comes in a context where the previous presidency, the Slovenian presidency, was suggesting to purposefully, expressly exclude GPAI from the scope of the regulation. And I think what the French presidency is saying now is that it should not be expressly excluded from the big definition. And that actually fits with what I was saying earlier, that I don't believe there should be express carve-outs from the definition, neither for GPAI nor for anything else. Because, again, where you need to be very strict, precise in what you define is when you define prohibited use cases of AI, high-risk use cases of AI, AI that requires transparency, so on and so forth. So blanket carve-outs, all general purpose AI should be excluded from the text from the scope of the regulation is something that I don't support either. So there, in fact, I am aligned with the position of the French presidency.
Okay, that makes good sense. And I wanted to share, I don't know if our audience can see it, but this is my new favorite app, which was developed by two French entrepreneurs. It's called Cheezam. I recommend that everyone look it up.
I'm a cheese fan, so I'm going to take it up.
So it uses AI. You tap in the center of the screen, and it will identify your cheese based on an AI program that has recognized all cheeses of the world. It will even recommend the right wine to go with it. Developed by two French entrepreneurs, and I think a great example of exactly what you're talking about. That's not something that implicates any fundamental rights that cheese might have. It's not something that is a high-risk behavior. It's exactly the kind of AI that shouldn't be subject to the kind of regulation you're talking about.
And it's not.
And it's not, exactly. So I thought that would be a good example, given France's
exactly.
comments there.
And I don't need to exclude expressly Cheezam out of the scope of the text. I don't need to say that. It is by default excluded because its effect have nothing to do with the effects that I'm trying to protect through legislation. It's as simple as that.
Right. It's a perfect example. And Angelica, I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little more on the suggestion that you made that Parliament and the Commission look to partnerships with industry and particularly industry standards development activities for good examples of how to implement high-risk AI. Can you talk a little bit more about Meta's experience with participating in industry standards activities, or even driving industry standards activities, industry collaboration, public-private partnerships, the kind of things you were talking about that are good examples, good models of how we can avoid an overly prescriptive regulatory process, but really allow policymakers to rely on some of the good work that has been done in industry to deploy AI in a way that benefits consumers.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, actually, AI standards will be extremely important to be in place soon. We don't know if it will be actually Senselelec or ETSI. I mean, it's something that we will see. And of course, industry should play an important role on these standards. I would say in general that many AI systems are profoundly complex, often the result of the combined effort of thousands of engineers around the world, and there are unanswered questions also about how to provide meaningful transparency while preserving at the same time privacy and trade secrets, all while maintaining fertile ground for crucial innovation. Limiting the most onerous regulatory burdens to high-risk AI systems is an important starting point. This acknowledges that existing regulatory framework are sufficient to protect consumers in most circumstances, while at the same time filling in important gaps, ensuring, for example, that fundamental rights are protected and still supporting innovation in lower risk applications. So in order to support innovation across Europe, it will be critical that high-risk AI systems are defined in ways that provide legal certainty, to industry and protect individuals, as also mentioned before. So we continue to encourage the Commission and the European Parliament to think about ways to develop best practices and, of course, best standards. However, we believe that clearer, more circumscribed requirements are necessary to ensure actors in the AI space, particularly, and I highlight this, small and medium enterprises and startups with limited resources know what is expected of them, when and how, so that they're also not deterred from innovating. Again, a broader collaboration of academia, civil society, industry and regulators is important to first define best practices, but also well-established international standards, actually, or European standards that, of course, can scale up later on at the international level.
That makes good sense, and again, seems to fit with your suggestion that industry needs to play a role and can play a role in development of those industry standards. ITI is actually an ANSI in the US and IEC in Europe accredited standards body, and we do a lot of work in this area. So that makes a lot of sense as well. We only have just a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to ask you for your thoughts on the role of voluntary industry standards. It would be kind of a phase two, it would be implementation of the work that you're doing at the Parliament in the AI Act. Should the AI Act be enacted into law, as Angelica was talking about, was talking about, is there a role that you see for that kind of voluntary industry standard activity to help implement the rules?
No, certainly so, and I can already tell you it's not going to be a secret soon when I will put my amendments, but already the way in the initial proposal of the Commission, the way the Commission suggests that in the absence of standards coming from standardization bodies, it will be the Commission itself that will come with specifications, is not something I'm prepared to support, because I do want to actually instill a sense of purpose and urgency and energy into these standardization bodies, and actually work with the industry to actually arrive as quickly as possible to a set of healthy, well-defined standards that will then help the players, small or big, to know what kind of AI they can produce and in what circumstances and at what standards. And I think, coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, this is where also the transatlantic work is going to play quite an important role, because as part of the TTC, under the umbrella of the TTC, on the US side, it is the NIST that is taking up this work, and the NIST is actually used very much to work in this way. NIST is actually producing these sort of voluntary, bottom-up, co-generated standards where they work with the industry. And I think that we can also learn a bit from that experience. And now under the TTC umbrella, NIST and I actually asked the European Commission what would be the interlocutor on the European side for NIST, because I don't think there is an obvious interlocutor. I think right now the Commission will be kind of playing that role. But I actually think that we should start thinking ourselves here in Europe whether we would not want some sort of a NIST at the European level ourselves. I close that bracket, but I think it's an important thought that needs to be kept in our minds for the months and years to come. But going back to standards again, already in the objectives that were set already in Pittsburgh, this issue of working on particularly those delicate areas, for example, bias. There's a lot of talk about bias in AI. But what is bias? How do you measure bias? How do you turn requirements on bias, having or not having bias, having data sets that are biased or not? How do you turn them into technical standards? It's a very important question. And under the TTC, the two sides are meant to work together with experts on standardization, with technical experts in actually providing the tools of the trade in how you define, how do you measure bias, so that afterwards, again, you would know how to enforce a piece of legislation, or on the US side, a Bill of Rights that will say you need to have unbiased algorithms. And they will continue to add to the work of the specific working group on AI, these sort of tasks under the TTC, where the two sides will be jointly putting their efforts into coming up with these sort of standardization work, and that, of course, reflected on both sides in the culture and tradition of each union of states, let's say this way. And here at the European level, there are already European standardization bodies where industry is being represented. I actually think that we need to look a little bit closer as how that actually is being done, because from what I understand, I'm not an expert, but from what I understand, maybe there needs to be a bit of a more focus in also representing better SMEs in these standard setting bodies. But clearly they have a crucially important role to play in the years to come.
That makes good sense. We just have about 2 minutes left, and Angelica, I want to ask for your closing thoughts on what you're hoping to see out of this process.
Yeah, so I'm certain that the new AI regulation will make sure that Europeans can trust what AI has to offer. What we will need is proportionate and flexible rules that will address the specific risks posed by the by AI systems, and also set high standards worldwide. I would also like to mention the coordinated plan which goes also together with the publication of the AI Act for the first release, so which outlines the necessary policy changes and investment at the member states level to strengthen Europe's leading position in the development of human-centric, sustainable, secure, inclusive, and trustworthy AI. As also Mr. Tudorakis mentioned, we need a collaborative policy making to ensure an appropriately balanced approach. Beyond the current discussion, I would like to highlight the importance of bridging the digital divide, which is crucial to having a fairer global economy, as an increasing amount of day-to-day basic services are becoming more digitized. It's important also that citizens of all genders, ethnicities, and generations need to be equipped with basic digital skills, especially if they want to participate in and benefit from the digital economy. And we should also bring digitization to the disadvantaged and digitally excluded areas. So to conclude, my advice also would be to policymakers in particular to create a diverse environment within member states, but also in businesses workforce, to assist all sectors of the economy to a transition actually to a fully connected digital economy. Okay, it's good to have regulations in place, but we should also ensure that people and Europeans in particular are equipped with the basic digital skills to thrive, understand, and work on this important technology as artificial intelligence is. Thank you once again for inviting me, and I was very happy to be with you, Mr. Tudorakis, and share this panel discussion today.
Thank you, Angelica. You've shared a lot with us, Dragos Tudorakis, about your roadmap and your plans and your philosophy. And I just want to ask for your closing thoughts on what the most immediate next steps are to move the AI Act forward, and what you need from us to help support your work.
Well, I think in the very immediate future, which means the next couple of days, basically we're still in collection mode. So we are trying to still learn and educate ourselves and gather all possible input to make sure that the amendments that we're going to have, and also the way we're going to play with these amendments and turn them into the compromises that we hope to build in the months to come, is based on as good of an understanding of what we're regulating as possible. So again, one thought is if you still have a smart idea that you want to send to me, my email is public, and I do invite you to send it. It's going to be put to good use. In terms of thoughts, again, AI is already into everything, and in the years to come is going to become even more an integral part of pretty much every product, every service that we're going to have as individuals and interact with. And therefore, it is, from my point of view, high time that we write the rules for that. And even if, yeah, it's going to be disruptive for an industry that has so far been very much still in pioneering mode for quite a number of years, and for companies big or small, anytime rules come in is a moment of disruption. And as legislators, we will be trying the best we can to make that disruption as let's say, positive or as constructive or as smooth as we can, understanding that there will have to be an effort. And we will try to also accompany that effort, particularly for the smaller actors, by also enforcing very much this role of sandboxes, which is something that we didn't talk about today, but I believe in very much, and I'm going to also actually invest in the amendments that I'm going to formulate a lot in actually boosting the role of sandboxes, taking them as much to the granular level of municipalities, regions, because I do think that particularly for the SMEs that are creating out there, they need to be as close as possible to a regulator where they can actually safely interact and engage in trial and error to make sure that what they put on the market is something safe without having to invest too much into regulatory compliance and army of compliance experts or lawyers. Which is something that big companies, I'm not that worried about Angelica and Meta, but I am worried about the SMEs. And I think a lot of the effort and a lot of the emphasis that we're going to put in these negotiations in the months to come, particularly on the, let's say, the business support part, is going to be to ensure this sort of level playing field and to ease as much as possible a burden that we understand for those that are doing high risk AI is going to be there.
That's great. That sounds a lot like the regulatory sandboxes that Angelica was talking about and suggesting in order to make sure that companies know what they're subject to. Also sounds like the regulatory dialogue that was incorporated as part of the DMA discussion, again, to make sure companies know what they can and can't do as they work to deploy innovative new solutions, and appreciate the recognition that AI is going to be everywhere and what an important and crucial and beneficial tool it is, and that policymakers are thinking through the implications of the work with an eye toward encouraging that innovative deployment of new services. Angelica, thank you so much for sharing your perspective from Meta today. Dragos Theodoraki, thank you very much for your leadership on these important legislative discussions here in Brussels and the willingness to listen to input and include an eye toward innovation and all the work that you're doing. And thank you to all of you for being with us on behalf of ITI, the Global Trade Association of the Tech Industry. It's our pleasure to have welcomed you here today for this important discussion on AI policy issues. We look forward to further dialogue on these issues and appreciate all in the audience who joined us virtually today, and look forward to seeing you for our next event.